think one of the ways that we evaluate the fertilizer nitrogen demand using the MRTN approach is to first look at yield response. That's where the lion's share of the work is done, right. Yield response to nitrogen fertilizer. But then we evaluate to make sure that the last pound of nitrogen applied is essentially paid for by the bushel of corn produced. And so in essence, you're getting the highest ROI possible out of that nitrogen fertilizer for that management system. And when we think about current price conditions, that certainly is an exercise that is worth doing. When we think about the looking at current price conditions, we're bouncing around 50 cents per pound of nitrogen as anhydrous ammonia. Certainly when you look at UAN prices, they're higher right now. That may change as we go into the spring. But when we're thinking about the ratio of corn price to nitrogen fertilizer, it's quite a bit lower than, we'll say, the number that we usually see in a 4 or 5 year running average. So usually we use a 10-to-1 ratio as something that we base a lot of evaluations off, and right now we're at about an 8-to-1 ratio. If we think about corn price per bushel to nitrogen fertilizer price per pound. And so when thinking about the maximum return to nitrogen rate, that's an evaluation of what fertilizer is going to lead to the highest economic return. A few things to consider right now in the fall is that when we come up with that number, we do consider fall applied ammonium phosphate, so from your MAP or DAP. We've seen from comparisons of fall applied and spring applied DAP and then spring applied UAN that we see, at least in our studies for across I believe 8 site years, we saw that the nitrogen supply was consistent across all timings of products.
So the recommendation that you would have for farmers would be, in essence, what?
Count your eggs, so to speak, or count your chickens. Do an accounting of the amount of nitrogen going out into the field as phosphorus fertilizer, as even the amount of water conditioner that you applied with herbicides. There's some probably AMS going out there. But when we think about the total amount of nitrogen applied to the corn crop, that's what we use to determine the economic optimum end rate, not just the nitrogen only fertilizer.
So manage for profitability instead of manage for yield.
Well, I say yes, firstly to answer that question is that's what we are looking at, the profitability of that nitrogen applied, but we're already maximizing yield. One of the things that we take from the research is that the yield where we've maximized yield with a given nitrogen rate, it's usually about 1 to 2 bushel difference from where we've maximized profit. It really doesn't shift down that much, we'll say, the response curve in changing between maximizing yield versus maximizing return to N. And I think that's really important, is that, and it reverberates through what we think about nutrient losses and use efficiencies. If we're maximizing yield, we've maximized that crop's internal and use efficiency to convert energy to a product that will harvest and sell.
Okay. Are farmers shortchanging themselves and not accounting for the nitrogen that may be in other fertilizers and kind of hurting themselves in that profitability scenario?
I certainly would consider it, especially when you're doing an accounting or balance of the amount of nitrogen that's going on to your fields before your corn crop or during your corn crop. Okay. We certainly know that if nitrogen is applied in the fall, it has a higher susceptibility to be lost, whether it's anhydrous ammonia or MAP or DAP. And so there's some risk in that. The challenge is that in general we've had some relatively dry falls that haven't led to a lot of fall nitrogen loss, and that's fairly consistent where most of the N loss that we see from leaching is in the spring. Weather fluctuations are unpredictable when we think about, let's say, 80-degree days in October or 80-degree days in March. We don't really have a great understanding of how those kind of blips in soil moisture and temperature affect the conversion of nitrogen. But in general, you're going to be more risk averse or not is going to be a decision each farmer needs to make. I think one of the challenges though that is important is making sure that if you've got N out there as your pea fertilizer, as most of the pea fertilizer is applied with co-applied with nitrogen, account for it.
What have I not asked about that's important to this conversation that you want farmers to know and or think about?
I think one of the big conversations that likely is going to come up this fall is prioritization of nutrients specifically in the realm that I work in. One of the ways that we can think about that is making sure that we have updated soil tests that are going to guide those, let's say, dry fertilizer decisions. Something to think about: if you've soil tested in 2020, 2022, 2024, those have all been pretty dry falls. And those may have, we'll say, biased or skewed potassium or pH numbers. And so in doing so, if you're soil sampling again this fall and it is dry in some parts of the state, some parts it's not, think about how those numbers may have been trending over time relative to your sampling conditions. Also, spring sampling is an option. We generally have more consistent moisture, but for you or your agronomist, the timing's got to work out. However, now is a great time to receive an ROI or high ROI to soil testing, because you're able to identify those grids or zones where they're high testing and they don't need to have PRK applied.